Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Thursday everybody. We have a big video today, a few brief matters before we move into the main stories. The EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has announced that he has COVID and as such has postponed his much anticipated trip to the PRC. Today, Thursday, the German foreign minister arrived in Beijing. And of course, France's Macron and the EU's von der Leyen have returned from their PRC trip too, which we covered at the time. This Saturday, we will do another deep dive into EU-China related developments. One other brief matter to touch on too, UK-based Japanese-owned Financial Times reports today that China has backtracked on its plan to block some of the world's busiest airspace near Taiwan this weekend, when G7 officials are also set to gather in Japan. The outlet writes that earlier this week, Beijing had said that it would impose a no-fly zone between the 16th and 18th of April, just north of Taiwan, in order to conduct aerospace activities. This would have coincided with the G7 meeting, and it is reported that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken would have needed to travel through the no-fly zone in order to reach the summit from Vietnam. Choosing to pick its battles, Beijing appears to have backed off the plan, with Taipei yesterday confirming that Beijing has shortened the duration of the airspace closure to just 27 minutes on Sunday. This comes, of course, after 3 days of military drills from the PLA around Taiwan, concluding on Monday of this week, in response to Tsai Ing-wen's recent trip to the US, where she met with lawmakers. The drills, which included more than 120 aircraft and a carrier, are the largest since the post-Pelosi trip drills last year. Okay, with that out of the way, let's begin with the main stories and start with the economy. According to real estate service provider CBRE Group Inc., office leasing in Beijing plunged 21% in Q1, quarter-on-quarter, signaling businesses' reluctance to expand in a shaky post-pandemic economy, in the words of one commentator. The number of deals signed to expand office space rental in Grade A office buildings in Beijing dropped 6% during the same period. The report also found that the vacancy rate for Grade A office buildings in the capital, which acts as a good barometer for the rest of the country when it comes to major cities, hit a record high of 16.8% in the first quarter. Also, Grade A office space in Beijing was 317.4 yuan, $46 per square meter per month during Q1, also down 1.3% from the previous quarter. The recovery in the rental market for office space is taking longer than previously expected, and even though the country is open, has declined quarter-on-quarter. Quote, "It may take 2 to 3 years for the Beijing office market to fully recover to pre-pandemic levels. There are more clients looking for new office space, but the actual number of contracts signed remains low." Another sector still greatly lagging behind pre-pandemic levels is the airline industry. We have already looked at how the major state-owned airlines were savaged in 2022, only surviving due to massive state support. But more than 3 months since opening China's borders, international travel remains stubbornly low. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai writes yesterday that, quote, "Recovery of international commercial air travel to and from the Chinese mainland has been patchy and below expectations," end quote. According to data platform Flight Master, the outlet points out, during the 7 days from March 20th, the number of flights was just 19% that of the traffic seen during the same period in 2019, 80% down. Adding, perhaps most concerningly, quote, "Industry consensus expects levels to rebound to only 30% this year," end quote. Indeed, the China Tourism Academy, in a February report, predicted that the number of Chinese inbound and outbound trips is expected to reach around 90 million in 2023, which is only about 31.5% of pre-pandemic levels. And this is all coming from Chinese analysts and officials, not Western commentators. We should note that in 2019, the vast majority of travelers to and from China were Chinese nationals. This is not the case of international tourists no longer coming. It's in large part Chinese themselves that are not traveling now. We also note that while domestic flying is also lower than pre-pandemic levels, it is nowhere near as bad as international flights. What's going on then? Well, the China Aviation Administration of China has stated that this is because, quote, airlines require more time to arrange capacity and schedules, and routes need regulatory approvals from both sides before they can resume, end quote. Indeed, poor US-China relations has meant that both sides are in no rush to open up routes to each other. Chinese and American airlines are still capped to a combined 24 weekly flights, well below the more than 300 flights seen per week pre-pandemic. Other geopolitical developments are relevant too. For example, the US-based New York Times writes this week that, quote, American and European carriers are not as eager to resume all their pre-pandemic flights to China, aviation analysts say. Since invading Ukraine more than a year ago, Russia has banned the American and European carriers from flying through its airspace, meaning flights to China now require longer routes with more fuel and flight crew. US carriers have been lobbying Washington to force Chinese airlines, which are still flying over Russia, to use the same routes as their American competitors, end quote. However, ultimately the two main reasons for the slow recovery in international flying are, 1. After 3 years of devastation, airlines, especially small and medium-sized ones, need time to rescale up their operations. And 2, household confidence and spending are still lower than pre-pandemic levels. Tomorrow we will be looking at other industries, including the critical property sector. Next up, US-based Pew Research has published its latest survey on US adults' views on the People's Republic of China, and the findings are not good. Unsurprisingly, the views are largely negative, but it is significant just how negatively the US now views China, as this has an obvious effect on public policy for China specifically and foreign policy generally. This survey specifically looks at the views of US adults, but we note that other recent surveys have also shown similar negative sentiment in other Western nations, as well as in developed Asian nations, with the exception of Singapore. Surveys conducted within China itself also show historically high levels of negative views towards the US, a trend which is acutely consistent with my own anecdotal experience on the ground. Now quoting the report directly. A large majority of US adults, 83%, continue to have negative views of China, and the share who have very unfavorable views, 44%, has increased by 4 percentage points since last year. Around 4 in 10 Americans also now describe China as an enemy of the United States, rather than a competitor or a partner, up 13 points since last year, according to a March 20 through 26, 2023 Pew Research Center survey. People are broadly concerned about China's role in the world, both geopolitically and in terms of specific issues. For example, the report writes, in the wake of the Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent visit to Moscow to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin, 62% of Americans see the China-US partnership as a very serious problem for the US, up 5 percentage points since October, and back to the original high levels seen in the immediate aftermath of the Ukraine invasion in 2022. China's growing technological power rates as a lower concern for many Americans than these other issues, though 4 in 10 describe it as a very serious problem. Yet another 2/3 of Americans are aware that TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is located in China, and by a more than 2-to-1 margin, more Americans support than oppose the US government banning TikTok. 28% are not sure. Americans are also critical of China's behavior on the international stage. Around 3/4 or more say China does not take the interests of other countries like the US into account, that it interferes in the affairs of other countries, and that it does not contribute to peace and stability around the world. Okay, and on this theme, we have one more important update to cover. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. And finally, for today's video, this week Indonesia's Coordinating Minister of Maritime and Investment Affairs has asked the China Development Bank to cut the interest rate of a loan to cover the cost of a multi-billion-dollar mega rail project. The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail project is a flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative in Indonesia, but the mega project has seen overcosts surge. Indonesia is seeking to cut the interest rate in half, from 3.4% down from 4% already, to a 2% rate, a theme which we've been following for the last few months amid the backdrop of poor nations seeking debt relief, is a new potential fault line in the global economic order, that is, a competition between a Chinese system of development finance and the more traditional Western model dominant since the end of World War II. Recently, Western commentators and officials have been critical of China's hardline approach to lending to and restructuring debt for developing nations. Beijing has stated that it will not participate in sovereign debt restructuring unless the World Bank and other regional development banks also agree to write down their own loans. US-based Politico writes this week that, quote, the World Bank dismisses that demand, arguing that development bank financing already comes with low interest rates and does not add significantly to a country's debt burden, end quote, adding that China's lending is decentralized among various institutions reluctant to take losses on their own loans. And while state-owned institutions like the China Development Bank are viewed by many as official government lenders, Beijing considers them corporate entities on par with the private sector and not subject to the same restructuring terms. US and European governments have opposed this demand too, arguing that doing so would essentially be a bailout for China. Despite all this, however, US-based Wall Street Journal reports this week, citing unnamed sources, that a compromise deal could be in the works. Quote, the new plan, if agreed, could see China drop this demand in return for big multinational lenders and regional partners such as the Asian Development Bank and African Development Bank making more explicit commitments to provide fresh low-cost financing, including grants to countries whose debt is being restructured. End quote. If the deal is reached, it could help finally result in a restructuring of debts for Zambia and, quote, serve as a model for multi-billion-dollar debt relief deals for other developing countries in financial distress, end quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.